let us begin with a slightly more grounded question. As a historian of Victorian culture, and particularly Victorian media, how has theory, as opposed to methodology or sort of philosophy of history, really impacted your research? And do you find it to be something that is at the forefront of your mind, or something that is implicitly part of your research into media?
Thanks. Yeah, this is a tricky one. I think if you'd asked me a few years ago, I'd have probably been quite sort of confident that I don't really use theory, that theory is not a part of my practice. It's not a thing that I've been particularly interested in. I was even quite hostile to it when I was an undergrad. I thought it was just a way of saying obvious things in a more complicated way. And so I was quite resistant to it. And yeah, I think in recent years, and in fact, even just as I was thinking before we had this chat, I definitely do use theory sometimes in ways without even really realizing it, and sometimes in ways that are slightly more open. So actually, I started jotting down all the kind of different theoretical concepts and ideas that I've sort of used at some point in my research. And actually, yeah, there are quite a few now that I realize I've been drawing on. I think if people were to read my work, they wouldn't see it as being a particularly prominent part of it. You wouldn't look and say, oh, this guy's really into his theory. My preference is to use it with quite a light touch. Sometimes I just think with a theory and then write without it, but it's definitely there in my work. And I think I found it useful, I think, if I'm completely honest. In the end, I'm sort of, my younger self will be surprised to hear me admit this, but I think in the end, I have found instances where either it helped me to understand a historical problem, or it gave me the kind of, I don't know, the language to explain it in a more convincing way. So in the end, yeah, there have been actually quite a few within that kind of broader cultural studies that I do that have allowed me to do things I probably couldn't have done just by thinking in methodological terms.
And do you think that that's something that you notice when you read, or does it feel quite implicit in other scholars in media history that theory is really an important part of our work?
There's a lot. I think a lot of my work. So one of the main fields I work in is this sort of Victorian periodicals and newspapers as my sort of main source. And there's a load of people from English literature in that field who I think are much more open about their theory. They tend to talk in theoretical terms much more commonly, and certainly at conferences. And so I think that I'm probably aware that my work is less theorized than a lot of people in my field, or at least they wear their theory more openly than perhaps I do. But I think, yeah, it's a very, very common thing. And there are certainly some theoretical concepts in media studies in particular that come up again and again and again, right? There are, whether we talk in terms of the sort of the public sphere and the way that print sort of shapes people's relationships, whether we think about, imagined communities, readers being bound together in these groups who might never meet, but are nevertheless part of this imagined community that Benedict Anderson talked about. So there are plenty of these kind of theories bouncing around in the field. I think that I just draw upon them when I find them useful. To be completely honest, and sort of drop them when I don't. That's been very much my philosophy on this. That theory, I'm only interested in when it's useful, when it allows me to do something. I think there are some scholars. Maybe I'm being unfair here. I think there are some people who really fetishize theory, who just want to work on it for its own sake and just love kind of unpicking it. And that's fine. But for me, it's a really utilitarian approach. If it allows me to say something I couldn't say without it, or to understand something in a powerful new way, I'll use it. But I'm perfectly happy to write something that has no theory in it if that's the best way to do it. So I just sort of pick it up and drop it whenever I want.
I think what you're saying there really resonates with a lot of people that I speak to when I talk about theory, is this idea that theory is a good thing, theory is useful, but it's not necessarily the main focus of a historian's work. And that really resonated with me, especially when you were talking about sort of picking it up when it helps you say something in particular. So it's a tool in your toolbox, but it's not something that you're trying to make the forefront of your work. So I think a lot of historians are perceived as, I'm going to put this the nicest possible way, incorrigible antiquarians, that we like to go and we like to get lots of data and we like to collect it and put it in a big pile, but we're not necessarily sure what to do with it once we have it. And in other disciplines, the whole point of collecting data is to create these theories and create these sort of models for existence. And historians, in my experience, don't really perceive their work in that way. They don't think of it as being just the first step in creating a theoretical model. It has value in and of itself. So I wonder if you could maybe speak to that for a minute. What do you sort of think of the historian's role in either the humanities or the social sciences, but that sort of idea of what is the purpose of historical research, the way it's actually done?
This is tricky, I suppose. I mean, look, at a really basic level, I feel like my job is just to figure out, just to understand the past, right? I mean, and that really is all that I want to do. I suppose there are two parts to, when I sort of boil it down, two parts to what we do, or certainly how I work. The first is a kind of internal thing. I want to understand something from the past. I want to figure out, okay, how did this happen? Why did it happen? What does this tell us? And the second thing I want to do is figure out a way to communicate that to someone. But that could be in any number of ways, right? It could be in a really data-driven scientific way of sort of establishing patterns. It could be in a narrative way. In truth, actually, I think, my personal preference for history, the way I love working, is finding curious things in the past and then talking about them in an entertaining way, which in many respects is like the least scientific approach to history imaginable, right? But yet there are moments as well where I think we really benefit from those slightly tighter methodologies and those perhaps more scientific approaches that might allow us to do things that we can't do in that slightly more novelistic or journalistic way. And so I think, yeah, again, it comes back to that point of picking things when they're useful to me. I think, yeah, that I've never really felt that I'm establishing a kind of theoretical model for understanding things that I could then, that somebody else might then apply. Although, yeah, again, I guess there are occasions where I've tried to do that. This is the thing where I realize I've been doing it accidentally again, isn't it? Like I haven't really been thinking about it. So actually, I'll give you an example about this. It's something I've been thinking about recently, because actually this is something we're both involved in. So we're in this sort of this research network on cosmopolitanism in the fin de siècle in Scotland.
Yes.
And it was really nice to be invited to this, and and I'm really curious about it. But I didn't really know anything about cosmopolitanism before I said I would join it. I don't work on Scotland, so I was kind of like wondering, like, what am I going to say when I come to do my talk for this? And they wanted me to talk about digital archives, and I've been sort of thinking, how do I do this in a way that might be relevant to that group? And I went to the first meeting online when people were sort of theorizing what is cosmopolitanism as a kind of thing, as a concept, and how is it applied in different places. And then I started thinking, like, what if we applied that idea to archives, our archives cosmopolitan, and what might happen if we made them more cosmopolitan? In other words, where do we take that theoretical model that people apply to cities and then apply them somewhere else? And I started sort of really getting loads of ideas out of it now as a sort of new way of thinking about archives. So in that sense, I think, okay, I have probably taken some kind of theoretical model there and then thought, okay, how can we apply that concept in places where it's unfamiliar? And in that sense, I guess maybe it is sort of a slightly new theoretical way of doing things, but yeah, not in quite the kind of robust sort of theoretical model that Burns is talking about, or the really predictive stuff that he's talking about. It's more, again, it's a tool for thinking, or sometimes it's a metaphor for thinking about something. And that tends to be how I work, I think.
I think you've expressed that in a really lovely way, the idea of a tool for thinking. And when I first began my historical training, I guess if we can call it that way, there was a lecturer in Indiana, in Bloomington, who said that the whole point of training future historians was habits of the mind and ways of thinking. And that really sort of summed up for me the humanities side of history. It wasn't so much about creating a perfect teachable set of reference points that if this happens, you should do this, but that the world is really complicated, and the more different perspectives or the more different ways you can look at a problem, the more likely you're not to get destroyed by something bad happening to you, that you can kind of cope with the world and even succeed in it. So the ways of thinking, I think, is a lovely way of putting it.